Here, look, I'll be brief because I think Senator Black has articulated that very, very well. This is a particularly important amendment, and it comes from a lot of engagement. I also want to thank Senator Higgins, who can't be with us today. But, you know, the protection of racial discrimination. You know, we've talked so much about racial discrimination in the last few years going forward, but historically we know that many children in care suffered racial discrimination. And I think it's something that when we've engaged with people, they're deeply hurt by their and damaged by their experiences. But this was an added layer. And there was that feeling that somehow it wasn't being acknowledged, that they acknowledged that things had moved on in the 80s, 90s, in the noughties, but somehow, historically looking back, they were very vulnerable. They were different anyway. They felt different. They were vulnerable. They were clearly different in terms of their colour. They were many of them were segregated from education. You've got to remember, in the 1960s, many of these children were educated internally behind the walls of institutions. Others did get out, and in many ways they then had to navigate the streets, the villages and the towns of Ireland, and be subject to racial abuse. But also they were treated differently. Historically, we're told, and having met people, and actually having lived with people who came from Africa and other parts of the world, they felt very, very different, and they felt marginalised. And in many cases, as a woman spoke to me recently here, said, you know, she arrived with her mother in a tribal dress, and within minutes it was ripped off her and disregarded. And so culturally, this was a girl at 6 and 7 years of age. This wasn't a baby that came into institutional care. And they were alienated from their past, their culture, their tradition, their beliefs, their background, and that was very damaging to them. And somehow, many of those people have struggled to get on in many other ways. Now, you add that to other complexities of life that challenge each and every one of us. The prejudice was too much for many of them. And somehow, this particular group, I believe outside of this legislation they're going to be vindicated. I think, Minister, I would say this: I'm confident standing here in Shannon today that if we don't do anything for them, other higher courts will do it, and we'll be back in here saying, why isn't it that somehow we didn't respond? Why isn't it that we didn't in some way address this issue? And I think it's an important issue, and the whole issue of racial discrimination, particularly for minors in our state, who we took into our state. We accepted them into our institutional care structures and systems, but we didn't do them a lot of good in there. And I think it's a particular issue, and I'd really be interested in hearing your view both on this amendment and is there any other way? And you will be aware, as will the Department of Justice be aware, that this is an ongoing issue with advocates. I'm not privy to discuss all of it here because it wouldn't be right of me, but I can tell you these will form and are already in the early stages of forming litigation against the state. Thank you. Margaret.